In all his years of television, Steve Harvey had never seen a letter like this one. It arrived in a simple white envelope. No return address, no production mark, just a handwritten name. For Mr. Steve Harvey. The assistant who handed it to him said it had come through the studio's general mail, not through his agent or the network. That alone was unusual. But what stopped him was the handwriting. It wasn't steady. It was the kind of penmanship that came from someone who still cared enough to write carefully even when their hands shook. Inside, there was only one page, folded neatly, and a photograph that had faded on its edges. The picture showed a woman and a little girl standing outside a small white church, sunlight breaking through behind them. The letter began with 6 words that would haunt him until the day she arrived. "I promised my daughter I'd find you." Weeks passed before Steve saw her face. It began like any other taping day, warm lights, music swelling, families laughing before the first question lit up the board. But somewhere in the crowd that afternoon sat a woman holding something close to her chest. That same photograph, now worn, folded and refolded, the ink on the back rubbed thin by years of waiting. Her name was Diane, and when the cameras started rolling, she didn't yet know that today would end a 20-year promise. She had written to Steve before, once every few years, never demanding, always hopeful. In the first letter, her daughter was 6. In the second, 12. The last one before this had come when the girl turned 18. Each letter had carried the same wish: to keep a promise made beside a hospital bed on the day her husband passed. "One day, I'll take you to meet the man who made your daddy laugh when he forgot how." Now she sat quietly in the second row, her daughter grown, no longer the little girl who used to fall asleep to the sound of Steve's voice on the television. 20 years of letters, 20 years of saving, 20 years of hope folded neatly into a single seat on the Family Feud set. Steve didn't notice her at first. The studio was its usual sea of smiles and expectation, applause rolling like ocean waves. He walked to his mark, cue cards in one hand, grin in place, his voice smooth as always. But that day, something about the air felt different, thicker, quieter, waiting. The cameras found their rhythm, but there was a pulse underneath, something human and unplanned. When the first question went up, laughter filled the room, and yet, from somewhere near the front, he caught a glimpse of a face that wasn't laughing. Diane sat with her hands clasped tight around that photograph, her eyes glassy but steady. There was a kind of recognition in the way she looked at him, not like a fan seeing a celebrity, but like someone finding a part of a story they thought they'd lost. Steve paused longer between jokes that day. His timing, usually flawless, stuttered once or twice, not from nerves but from instinct. He couldn't explain it, but he felt something calling his attention toward her row. Years of hosting had taught him to read a room, to sense when something sacred was sitting just below the surface. Halfway through the show, during a break in filming, one of the producers whispered something in his ear. "The woman in row 2 wrote those letters," she said softly. "The ones you kept." Steve turned toward the crowd again, blinking under the studio lights. The warmth of the stage lamps blurred with something else, memory, maybe gratitude. He didn't speak right away. The cameras weren't rolling, but the room stayed hushed as if they were. "Is she here?" he asked quietly. The producer nodded. He found her eyes. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then she stood, holding the photograph against her chest like an anchor. The crowd shifted, confused, unsure if this was part of the show. Steve motioned gently for the cameras to stay still. "Ma'am," he said, his voice tender but firm, "come on up here." Applause started, hesitant at first, then building, as Diane made her way toward the stage. She walked carefully, like someone afraid to step too hard on a moment they'd waited too long to reach. When she reached him, she handed him the photo. He turned it over and saw the handwriting, his own name, the year faded but still there. "This was my husband's favorite show," she said softly. "He was fighting cancer back then. We used to watch you every night, and he said if laughter could heal, you were the medicine. When he passed, I promised our daughter I'd find you and tell you thank you myself." Steve's jaw trembled. His hand went to his mouth, cue cards forgotten. 20 years, he whispered. You kept that promise 20 years. Tears welled in Diane's eyes, but she smiled through them. He used to say, people like you remind the world that kindness still makes noise, she said. I just wanted you to know he was right. For the first time in that studio's long history, nobody clapped, nobody moved. Steve looked down at the photograph again, then back at her, his voice breaking. You did what love does, it waits. The silence that followed was heavy, not with sadness, but with reverence. In that moment, the bright game show stage felt like a church, the applause light replaced by something holier, the sound of hearts remembering. Steve wiped his eyes and gestured gently toward the cameras. Let's roll, he said. This one's for him. The lights dimmed slightly, and the next round began, but no one was playing for points anymore. When the taping resumed, it no longer felt like a show. The energy in the room had shifted, softened, slowed as if every person watching understood that something sacred had just begun. Steve stood at the center of the stage, cue cards hanging loosely in his hands, eyes still glistening beneath the warm studio lights. He tried to regain his rhythm, to pick up the familiar beat of jokes and questions, but his voice carried a tremor that told everyone this wasn't just television anymore. Diane stood at the edge of the stage, uncertain whether she should return to her seat. Steve noticed and motioned gently for her to stay. You're part of this now, he said with a quiet smile, his voice thick with emotion. Don't go anywhere. Behind her, the audience leaned forward, hundreds of strangers drawn together by the fragile beauty of one woman's promise. On one of the cameras, a red light blinked on, capturing every detail. The shimmer of tears on Steve's cheeks, the way Diane clutched that photograph, the silence that felt like a prayer. Then, from the wings, a stagehand appeared, holding a small envelope. He handed it to Steve and whispered something in his ear. Steve's eyes flickered with surprise. What's this? He murmured. The stagehand simply nodded toward Diane. Her hands flew to her mouth. Oh my God, she whispered. Steve turned the envelope over. On the front, in faded blue ink, was a name he hadn't seen in years, Calvin Richardson, her husband's name. Diane's knees almost buckled. She covered her face, trembling. The stagehand explained softly. It was sent to the studio 19 years ago. It got lost in an old filing cabinet. We found it last week when they cleared out the archive. Steve's voice cracked. 19 years ago? The producer nodded. It was addressed to you. Steve stared at the envelope as if it were made of glass. Slowly, he opened it, careful not to tear the edges. Inside was a single page, yellowed slightly with time, the handwriting uneven but full of life. Steve's lips moved silently as he read. Then he looked up at Diane. Would you like me to read it? He asked gently. She nodded, unable to speak. Steve drew a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly. His voice was low, reverent, each word landing softly in the stillness. Dear Mr. Harvey, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but my name is Calvin. My wife and I watch you every night. You make her laugh, and when she laughs, I remember what living feels like. The doctors say I won't see another Christmas, but I wanted to thank you before I go. You've shown me that a man can be strong and kind at the same time, and that laughter is a kind of faith. When I can't breathe, I turn on your show, and somehow, the pain doesn't win. If my little girl ever meets you one day, tell her, her daddy said, to keep laughing, that joy is where we find each other again. With love, Calvin Richardson. By the time Steve reached the last line, his voice was gone. He pressed the paper to his chest, tears running freely now. The audience sat motionless, no coughs, no whispers, no phones, just the quiet sound of hearts breaking open. Diane wept openly, her hands shaking as she reached for the letter. I didn't know he sent it, she said, her voice trembling like glass. He never told me. Steve took her hands, folding them gently around the note. He kept his promise too, he said softly. He found a way. The band didn't play. The lights dimmed to a soft amber glow. Even the cameras seemed to bow. Steve turned slightly toward the audience. You all just witnessed something real, he said quietly. Something that doesn't fit in a 30-minute show. He looked at Diane again. Your husband's words, they just filled this room. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes. Someone else whispered, "Lord, have mercy." Steve smiled through his tears. He said, "Laughter's a kind of faith." I think he was right, because right now, I can feel God in this silence. Diane reached into her purse and pulled out something small, a keychain, old and tarnished, shaped like a microphone. "He gave this to me the night before he died," she said softly. He said, "Keep this close, because one day we'll laugh together again." I think today was that day. Steve swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, ma'am, it sure was." He turned toward the camera again, trying to speak, but the words failed him. He laughed instead, a short, shaky laugh that carried more truth than any speech could. "We're supposed to be playing a game here," he said, wiping his eyes. "But sometimes, the Lord just changes the program." The audience rose slowly to their feet. Applause began like a ripple, gentle at first, then fuller, richer, rising into the rafters. It wasn't for the show. It was for love that had waited 20 years to find its way home. Steve folded the letter once, carefully, and slipped it into his pocket. "We'll keep this safe," he said to Diane. "Not just the paper, the promise." As they stood there, a grieving widow, a daughter's memory, and a man whose laughter had become a bridge between heaven and earth, something unspoken passed between them. It was bigger than television. It was humanity remembering itself. The cameras rolled quietly, capturing the glisten of tears on stage, the way Steve reached out and pulled Diane into a gentle embrace. For a moment, the bright game show set looked less like a stage and more like a sanctuary. When the lights came back up after the next break, the crew didn't bother calling for retakes. They all knew whatever had just happened didn't need a second version. The director whispered into his headset, "Let it play how it is." And even the camera operators, people trained to stay invisible, found themselves trembling behind their lenses. Steve stood a moment longer at center stage, hands resting on the cue cards that no longer meant anything. Then he looked toward Diane and her daughter, who had now joined her mother under the soft gold of the lights. The girl looked barely 20, her hair pinned back, her hands clasped together, the same calm eyes her father must have had. "Sweetheart," Steve said gently, lowering himself so their eyes met, "your daddy's words have been sitting in this room for 20 years waiting for you." She nodded, tears shining but not falling. "Mom says he always believed laughter would find us again." Steve smiled, a little broken but full of warmth. He was right. He believed right. The audience sat utterly still, each person holding their breath, afraid to break the moment. One of the musicians in the band quietly set his trumpet down, the sound of metal touching wood whispering through the silence. Diane reached for her daughter's hand and turned toward Steve. "I almost gave up," she said softly. "When the letters kept coming back unopened, I thought maybe it was silly to keep hoping. But then, one day, I just told myself, no promise made in love is ever wasted." Steve took a slow step toward them, his voice trembling with respect. "No, ma'am," he said. "Love doesn't get lost. It just waits for its turn." The mother and daughter stood together, framed by the shimmer of the studio lights. And for a long breath, the show stopped pretending to be a show. The audience was crying quietly now. Men, women, strangers wiping tears off their cheeks without shame. You could almost hear hearts remembering what faith feels like when it finally comes home. Steve turned to the production team. "Bring the cameras down here," he said softly. "I want the people to see this the way I'm seeing it." The lenses tilted and zoomed in, capturing Steve's face as he reached out and took Diane's hand again, his thumb gently pressing against her knuckles. His voice was low, almost reverent. "I've spent my whole life trying to make people laugh," he said. "But sometimes, God gives you a moment that reminds you what laughter's for. It's not just joy, it's proof that the light can get in even after the world breaks you." The crowd murmured, an echo of agreement, as if he had given them a piece of truth they hadn't realized they'd been waiting to hear. He looked at the daughter again. "Your daddy must have been a special man," he said softly. "He was," she whispered. "He used to say you were like family. We never met you, but he said you made our living room feel less empty." Steve pressed his lips together to keep them from shaking. "I'm honored to be part of his story," he said, voice heavy with gratitude. A producer offstage tried to signal that they needed to resume the game, but Steve shook his head slightly. "Not yet," he said. "This moment ain't over." Then, as if the entire universe had been waiting for the same cue, the band began to play again, not the upbeat Family Feud theme, but something quieter. A gospel riff, slow and tender, filled the studio. The drummer brushed the snare with his sticks, and a piano note hung in the air like prayer. Steve looked toward the audience and gestured for everyone to rise. "Let's give this family the kind of love they gave the world," he said. Applause rose steady, gentle, healing. Diane held her daughter close as people stood, clapping through tears. Steve stepped back, letting them have the light. His expression caught somewhere between joy and sorrow. When the sound finally softened, he looked back at the camera. "You know," he said, voice hoarse but steady, "you never really know who's listening. Maybe the person you're making laugh tonight is fighting to stay alive. Maybe the person next to you is praying for one more day of hope. That's why you've got to keep showing up with love. Every day. Because you might just be someone's reason to smile." Diane wiped her eyes. The crowd went silent again, absorbing every word. The director whispered, "We'll keep rolling. Don't cut." Steve turned to Diane and her daughter once more. "I want you to know," he said, "your husband's letter, his faith, it's not staying in my pocket. It's going up on that wall backstage, where every guest walks by. Because the world needs to see what a promise kept looks like." The daughter smiled through tears. "He'd like that," she said softly. "He'd probably say you're still doing the Lord's work in disguise." Steve laughed, wiping at his face. "Yeah, he'd be right about that, too." He reached for Diane's shoulder. "You kept his promise, ma'am," he said. "You carried it farther than most people ever could." Then, as if by instinct, he folded his hands in front of him, and the audience followed suit. The music quieted. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full, like the air right before dawn. "Let's take a second," Steve said softly, looking up toward the studio lights. "Let's thank God for laughter, for love, and for promises that never die." Heads bowed across the studio. A few sobs broke through the quiet. Steve closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the stillness. When he opened them, a tear glimmered in the golden light. "Now that," he whispered, voice breaking again, "that's real television." He motioned gently to the camera crew, signaling the end of the segment. The lights dimmed, the band faded out, and Steve placed the folded letter gently back into Diane's hands. "You keep that close," he said. "That's your husband still talking." She nodded, her smile trembling. "And you keep doing what you do," she said. "You're helping people remember that love doesn't go away just because someone does." Steve smiled. "Yes, ma'am. I'll remember that." The director's voice came through the intercom. And cut. But nobody moved. For a long moment after the word cut, no one breathed. The red tally lights on the cameras dimmed, but the emotion didn't fade with them. It lingered thick, sacred, suspended in the soft hum of studio air. Crew members, who had filmed hundreds of shows and thought they'd seen everything, stood frozen. One of the sound techs quietly removed his headset to wipe his eyes. The pianist kept his fingers resting gently on the keys, afraid that even a single note might shatter what was left of the silence. Steve Harvey stayed on stage. He didn't walk off, didn't crack a joke, didn't reset for the next taping. Instead, he looked out into the audience, scanning the faces hundreds of strangers who were now bound together by something invisible, but unmistakable. The feeling that they had just witnessed, grace. Diane still stood beside her daughter, both clutching the letter like something holy. Steve stepped toward them once more, speaking softly so only the microphones close to him could catch it. "You gave me a gift today," he said. "I can't even explain it. 20 years ago, your husband sent hope into this world, and it just arrived right on time." Her eyes glistened. "Maybe it was always meant to find you now," she said. He nodded slowly, understanding in the way that only comes when life teaches you patience. "Yeah," he said, voice rough but steady. "God's got perfect timing. It's us who always want to rush him." A soft laugh rippled through the audience, wet with tears. The sound was gentle, healing. Steve looked toward the band. "Play something light," he said. "Let's lift this room a little." The pianist began again, slow gospel chords blooming like sunrise. Steve turned back to Diane and her daughter. "You two just reminded all of us that promises never die. They might go quiet for a while, but they don't disappear." Then, he did something he'd never done before on a show. He invited them to sit on the stage steps beside him. The cameras weren't rolling anymore, but the moment didn't care. He sat down beside them, the three of them framed by soft golden light, as if heaven itself had chosen a color temperature. Steve looked out into the seats. "We do a lot of laughing on this stage," he said quietly. "That's what I love about it. But every once in a while, life walks in and reminds you this ain't just about jokes. It's about connection, about remembering each other." The daughter rested her head lightly on her mother's shoulder. "He used to say that," she murmured. Steve smiled. Then he was right. You can't heal alone. You need somebody to sit next to you, even if all they do is breathe in the same air. He looked back toward the cameras that had stopped recording. "I want this part to stay in," he told the director. "Even if it's raw, especially because it's raw." The director hesitated. "Steve, that's not how we usually cut it." Steve's eyes softened. "Yeah, well, love doesn't usually follow a script." The audience applauded again, not loud this time, but with the kind of rhythm that sounded like understanding. Diane's daughter turned towards Steve, her voice fragile but sure. "Can I tell you something my dad used to say?" "Of course, sweetheart," Steve said. He said people think laughter and tears are opposites, but he said they live in the same house. They just use different doors. Steve froze. His mouth opened, but no words came. The simplicity of it struck him deeper than anything else that night. He nodded slowly. "Your daddy," he knew truth. For a long while, he didn't move. The audience stayed silent, no one daring to break the spell. Then Steve stood, straightened his jacket, and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I think we all needed that," he said softly. "You know, you spend your life chasing moments that make you feel alive, and then one sneaks up on you when you least expect it." He turned to Diane and her daughter. "Do you mind if I pray with you?" Diane shook her head. "Please." He took their hands, closing his eyes as the lights dimmed even lower. "Father," he said gently, "thank you for promises that hold even when the people don't. Thank you for laughter that heals and tears that wash what laughter can't. And thank you for the chance to witness love that lasts longer than time." A quiet amen moved through the room, scattered at first, then joined together like a soft wave. When he opened his eyes again, Diane was smiling through tears. Her daughter squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Harvey," she whispered. Steve exhaled. "No," he said quietly. "Thank you. Y'all reminded me what this stage is for." The audience clapped again, rising to their feet. A few people reached for each other's hands. For a moment, the Family Feud studio, normally a place of jokes and games, felt like a church filled with light and relief. As they walked off stage, Steve turned to the floor manager. "Hold off the next taping for a few minutes," he said. "Let's not chase this moment away." The crew nodded silently. No one protested. Back in the hallway, Diane stopped him before he could head to his dressing room. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. He smiled, shaking his head. "You already did. You kept your promise. That's bigger than any thanks." Her daughter stepped forward. "My dad would have liked you." Steve chuckled softly, his voice still thick. "Sweetheart, I think I would have liked him too." They said their goodbyes, and as the mother and daughter disappeared down the hallway, Steve stood there for a long time, holding the letter again, reading the words one more time under the faint hum of backstage lights. He whispered to himself, "Keep making people laugh until heaven runs out of tears." Then he closed his eyes and said softly, "I'm trying, brother. I'm trying." Later that night, long after the studio had emptied and the laughter from the audience had faded into memory, Steve sat alone in his dressing room. The mirror lights still glowed softly around him, the bulbs reflecting off the framed photographs of past contestants. smiles frozen mid-laughter. But the room felt quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that follows after something sacred has passed through. He laid the letter from Calvin on the table in front of him, smoothing the creases with his palm. The paper was thin now, softened by age, its edges slightly frayed. He read it again, slowly this time, as though it were scripture. Keep making people laugh until heaven runs out of tears. The words trembled in his chest like an echo that refused to leave. Steve had seen thousands of faces pass across that stage, winners, losers, dreamers, and broken hearts. But tonight, something inside him shifted. The show, the jokes, the applause, all of it felt smaller compared to the quiet strength of a woman who had kept her promise for 2 decades, and a man who had sent a letter from the edge of his life to remind the world what love sounds like when it refuses to die. He looked up at the mirror, and for a moment, he didn't see a celebrity staring back. He saw a man who had been blessed with the chance to carry other people's stories, stories of pain, grace, and laughter, into the light. His own eyes were red, but there was a warmth behind them, a sense of awe that made him whisper to the empty room, "This is why I'm still here." On the wall behind him hung a corkboard filled with thank you notes from contestants and families. Steve reached up and carefully pinned Calvin's letter at the very top. It didn't belong in a drawer, hidden away. It needed to stay in the light where every crew member, every guest, every passing soul could see it and remember what the show was really about. Moments later, there was a soft knock at the door. A young production assistant stepped in, hesitant. "Mr. Harvey? The network wants to know if you'd like to reshoot that segment, in case it feels too heavy for broadcast." Steve smiled faintly. "No," he said. "Let it be. The world's got enough noise. Maybe it could use a little silence." The assistant nodded, eyes shining. "It was beautiful, sir." After she left, Steve sat again, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. The studio beyond his door was empty now, just the distant sound of janitors sweeping confetti off the floor. He imagined Diane and her daughter back at their hotel, the letter safe between them, maybe laughing through tears the way people do when love hurts less than it used to. He whispered a quiet prayer. "Lord, thank you for letting me be a part of that story just for a minute." Hours later, when he finally stood to leave, he turned off the mirror lights one by one. The room sank into dimness, except for the small halo of glow around the letter. It was almost as if the paper itself was giving off light. The following week, the episode aired. There were no edits, no cuts, no laugh track, just the story, honest, unpolished, and deeply human. Millions of viewers tuned in expecting a game show and found something closer to a sermon. Social media exploded with messages from people who had lost someone, people who had promised something and were still holding on. One man wrote, "I turned on the TV to forget my problems. Instead, I remembered what faith feels like." A woman from Georgia said, "I called my son after 10 years of silence because of that episode." The letters poured in. The producers had to set up an extra desk just to sort through them. Nurses wrote about playing the episode in hospital wards. Teachers wrote about showing it to their students. One pastor wrote simply, "This week's sermon has already been preached on national television." Steve read every message. Some he answered himself. Some he just prayed over quietly. Each one reminded him that what happened on that stage had rippled far beyond the bright lights of Family Feud. Months passed, and yet, every time he walked by the corkboard, he'd pause to look at Calvin's letter. One day, he noticed something new. A small sticky note beneath it, left by a crew member. It read, "Promise kept." He smiled. "Yeah," he whispered, "promise kept." The next season, when the producers asked what theme he wanted to open the show with, Steve said, "Let's call it the Promise episode. And don't make it about ratings, make it about remembering." They invited Diane and her daughter back, not for a reunion or spectacle, but simply to sit in the audience. No surprise twists, no staged emotions, just presence. When the cameras rolled, Steve opened the show the same way he always did, but this time, there was something different in his tone. "Welcome to Family Feud," he said with a smile. "We laugh here, we joke, but sometimes we witness life. And if you've ever made a promise to someone you love, this one's for you." The applause that followed wasn't wild or loud. It was steady, real. The kind that came from people who understood. After the taping, Steve walked them backstage again. Diane hugged him tightly, her voice shaking. "I think he'd be proud," she said. "He is," Steve replied. "I can feel him every time someone laughs." The daughter handed him a small gift, a framed photo of the three of them from that first day, standing under the studio lights. Beneath it, she had written in careful script, "Laughter doesn't end, it just echoes." Steve's throat tightened. "That's going on my wall, right next to the letter," he said. As the family left, he stood at the doorway of the studio one last time, watching the lights dim across the empty set. The same floor where game shows were played had become a chapel of remembrance, a place where laughter and loss had found each other again. And somewhere in that stillness, Steve whispered the same words he'd spoken 100 times before, but this time they carried the weight of truth. Sometimes, television doesn't just entertain, it heals. If this story touched your heart, subscribe and share so the world never forgets moments like these. This is Stories Left Behind, where human stories are never lost.